April 28, 1944. Dawn breaks over Slapton Sands, a quiet English beach in Devon. But this morning, the waves are carrying something that shouldn't exist. Hundreds of American bodies, bobbing face down in their life vests, washing ashore like driftwood. Their uniforms are soaked with seawater and diesel fuel. Their skin is gray from hypothermia. Many still clutch their rifles. Military police immediately cordoned off the entire coastline. Locals are turned away at gunpoint. Doctors are ordered to falsify death certificates. Bulldozers dig mass graves in the hills above the beach, while witnesses are threatened with arrest if they speak a word of what they've seen. The question that would haunt the high command for weeks: how did 749 American servicemen die in a rehearsal for D-Day, more than would die on the actual Utah beach, without the public ever knowing? And why did General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, nearly cancel the entire invasion over 10 missing bodies? This is the story of Exercise Tiger, the disaster they couldn't let you know about, the training exercise that became a massacre, the cover-up that lasted 40 years, until now. In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, they faced a critical problem. How do you prepare tens of thousands of soldiers for something that has never been done before? The answer was brutal realism. They needed a training ground that could replicate the beaches of Normandy down to the smallest detail. After extensive reconnaissance, they found it: Slapton Sands in Devon on England's southern coast. Slapton Sands was chosen for one brutal reason. Its topography was nearly identical to Utah Beach, one of the 5 landing zones designated for D-Day. The beach featured gently sloping shingle, backed by a freshwater lagoon, with hills rising beyond, the exact terrain American forces would face in Normandy. But there was a problem. People lived there. Entire villages dotted the coastline. In November 1943, over 3,000 residents received evacuation notices from the War Department. They had 6 weeks to pack up their entire lives and leave. No exceptions. No debate. Their homes, their farms, their churches, everything would become a military combat zone. Some families had lived in those villages for generations. They left with whatever they could carry, not knowing if they would ever return. By December 1943, Slapton Sands was a ghost town. Then it became something else, a killing field by design. The U.S. Army and Navy transformed the area into a full-scale invasion simulator. Naval artillery batteries were positioned offshore to provide live bombardment. The beach was mined and fortified to replicate German defenses. Observation posts were established in the hills to critique every aspect of the assault. Exercise Tiger was not a drill. It was a full-dress rehearsal for Force U, the American assault force of approximately 30,000 troops designated to take Utah Beach on D-Day. Beginning April 22, 1944, the exercise would simulate everything: the extended sea journey across the English Channel, complete with seasickness and cramped conditions, ships fully loaded with fuel and ammunition far beyond what was necessary for a training exercise, and live naval bombardment of the beach to harden troops to the sights, sounds, and terror of real combat. This was not optional. Under direct orders from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, these men would be exposed to actual battle conditions, live rounds fired over their heads, real explosives detonated on the beach around them, because Eisenhower believed only fear, only the visceral experience of being shot at, could adequately prepare them for what was coming. Some men would die in the rehearsal. That was expected, acceptable, a necessary sacrifice to save lives on the actual invasion. But the seeds of catastrophe were already planted, invisible to the thousands of men loading onto ships. The radio frequencies used by the American LSTs and their Royal Navy escorts were not standardized, a communication breakdown that would prove fatal. American ships operated on frequency 1950 kilohertz. British escorts used 2850 kilohertz. They couldn't talk to each other. In a night attack, this would be disastrous. Worse, the convoy's only heavy escort, the World War I-era destroyer HMS Scimitar, had been damaged in a minor collision days before the exercise and was sitting in Plymouth for emergency repairs. Her absence stripped the convoy of its primary defensive capability. The decision to pull her from escort duty was made by the Royal Navy and never properly communicated to Force U Command. No replacement was provided. No one seemed to realize or care that the slow, lumbering LSTs would cross Lyme Bay virtually defenseless. The LSTs themselves were death traps in combat. Landing ship tank vessels were designed for one purpose: to beach themselves on enemy shores, drop their bow ramps, and disgorge tanks and troops directly onto the sand. They were essentially floating garages, 328 feet long, with flat bottoms and massive tank decks. Their top speed was barely 10 knots, slower than most cargo ships. They had virtually no armor, no meaningful defensive armament. They were designed to land, not fight. And on the night of April 27th, 8 of them would sail into the crosshairs of one of the most lethal naval forces in the European theater.
The night of April 27th, 1944. Convoy T4, consisting of 8 LSTs, began its journey across Lyme Bay toward Slapton Sands. The sea was calm, the surface like black glass. The moon was nearly full, a tactical nightmare that illuminated everything. Visibility was excellent, perfect conditions for a predator. Inside the LSTs, soldiers sat packed shoulder to shoulder in the troop compartments, trying to sleep in full combat gear. M1 Garand rifles slung over shoulders, steel helmets, backpacks loaded with rations, ammunition, and personal effects. Many were seasick. The smell of vomit mixed with diesel fumes and sweat. Some men played cards under dim red lights. Others wrote letters home, not knowing if they'd ever be sent. The ship's cavernous tank decks below were crammed with Sherman tanks chained to the deck, jeeps, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and crates upon crates of live ordnance. Everything was loaded with live ammunition and fuel, exactly as it would be on D-Day. The ships were floating bombs. At 0207 hours on April 28th, the night exploded. German E-boats, Schnellbooten in their native tongue, or S-boats in Allied parlance, out of Cherbourg, had stumbled upon the convoy by sheer accident. 9 boats from the 5th and 9th Schnellboot flotillas were on routine patrol when their radio reconnaissance operators picked up unusual radio traffic. Then their radar spotted it. A massive, slow-moving formation of ships, completely unescorted, silhouetted against the moonlit sea. The E-boat commanders couldn't believe their luck. These were not lumbering warships, they were predators. Sleek, wooden-hulled torpedo boats, roughly 115 feet long, capable of speeds up to 40 knots, armed with 20-millimeter cannons and multiple torpedo tubes designed for one purpose: nighttime hit-and-run attacks on Allied shipping in the Channel. Their wooden construction made them nearly invisible to radar. Their powerful Daimler-Benz diesel engines could outrun any escort. They were the wolves of the English Channel, and they had just found a defenseless flock. The E-boats moved in, engines throttled back to reduce wake, approaching from multiple angles. Then they opened fire. Tracer fire arced through the darkness in brilliant streams of red and white. The LSTs, designed for beach landings rather than naval combat, were sitting ducks. Their thin hulls offered no protection. Their deck guns were manned by sailors who had never faced live combat. Some LSTs tried to return fire, their .50 caliber machine guns chattering into the night, but the E-boats were too fast, weaving at high speed through the darkness. At 0217, LST 531 positioned in the middle of the convoy, was struck by 2 torpedoes in rapid succession. The explosions ripped through her hull amidships. The impact threw men off their feet. Then came the secondary explosions. Fuel ignited instantly, sending fireballs through the interior compartments. Men trapped below decks, soldiers in full combat gear, Navy crew in the engine room were incinerated within seconds or drowned as seawater flooded the compartments faster than they could react. Witnesses on nearby ships described the horror. The screaming, the scramble for exits that no longer existed because the torpedo blasts had buckled the interior bulkheads and jammed the hatches shut. Men pounded on steel doors that wouldn't open. Others were sucked down as the ship listed violently to port. LST-531 sank in less than 10 minutes. Of the 496 men aboard, only 29 survived. 467 men went down with the ship, the single greatest naval loss of life in a single incident for American forces in the European theater during World War II. LST-507, positioned at the rear of the convoy, took a direct torpedo hit on her starboard side moments later. The explosion sheared through the engine room, killing everyone inside instantly. Diesel fuel poured into the water and ignited, turning the sea around the ship into a lake of fire. Men jumping overboard found themselves landing in burning water. Those who surfaced were covered in flaming oil. Lieutenant John Doyle Swartz, the ship's commanding officer, remained calm in the chaos. He ordered abandon ship. Then he did something extraordinary. He gave his own life vest to a young sailor who had none, then stayed aboard to ensure every man who could escape did. He moved through the burning compartments, directing men to lifeboats, pulling injured sailors up ladders, refusing to leave until he was certain no one else could be saved. Swartz would die of exposure and shock hours later, floating in the freezing water. He was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for valor. He was 27 years old. But the horror was just beginning. The men who made it off the burning ships, hundreds of them, thrashing in the black water, screaming for help, faced a new enemy, the English Channel in April. Water temperature, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, hypothermia sets in within minutes. Muscle function deteriorates. Rational thought becomes impossible. Men simply stopped moving, their bodies shutting down as the cold seeped into their core. But what killed most of them wasn't the cold, it was their life vests. In the chaos of deployment and the rush to begin the exercise, no one had properly trained the soldiers on how to wear the inflatable life belts issued to invasion forces. The belts, known as Mae Wests, were designed to be fastened around the chest, under the armpits, where they would keep a man's head above water. But most soldiers had never used them before. In the confusion, they wore them around their waists, like a regular belt. When they hit the water wearing 60 pounds of combat equipment, rifles, ammunition, steel helmets, backpacks, and trenching tools, the weight distribution was catastrophic. The life vest around their waist acted as a fulcrum. The weight of their gear pulled their upper body down. They flipped face first into the water and couldn't right themselves. Hundreds of American soldiers drowned in their life vests, held underwater by the very equipment meant to save them, thrashing in the freezing black water until exhaustion took them and their lungs filled with seawater. Rescue vessels arrived hours later. By then, the sea was a graveyard. Bodies floated everywhere, many still wearing their packs, bobbing face down in the gentle swells. The living clung to wreckage and each other, their lips blue, their speech slurred from hypothermia. Some had been in the water for over 4 hours. Many would die shortly after rescue, their core temperatures too low to recover.
When the sun rose over Slapton sands on the morning of April 28th, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Bodies washed ashore in waves. The initial body count was staggering, and it kept climbing. 749 American servicemen dead. To put that in perspective, it was more than would die on Utah Beach itself 5 weeks later during the actual D-Day invasion. But for General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Allied High Command, the death toll wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what they didn't know. 10 officers were missing. In the chaos, in the dark water, amid the hundreds of bodies being pulled from the channel, 10 officers could not be accounted for. And these weren't ordinary officers. Every single one of them held bigot clearance, a security classification beyond top secret, reserved exclusively for personnel with knowledge of the exact date, exact time, and exact beach locations of the D-Day landings. The term bigot was derived from to jib, Gibraltar, stamped on orders for officers traveling to North Africa, read backwards. It meant you knew everything. If even one of those officers had been captured alive by the Germans, if the E-boats had plucked a single bigot-cleared survivor from the water and delivered him to Gestapo interrogators in Cherbourg or Paris, the entire invasion could be compromised. Under torture, and the Gestapo was expert at extracting information, he might reveal the date, June 5th, later postponed to June 6th. He might reveal the beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. He might reveal troop strengths, deception plans, the location of Eisenhower's headquarters. The Germans could reposition their panzer divisions. They could fortify the exact landing zones. They could turn D-Day into a slaughter. Eisenhower faced a nightmare scenario. Cancel D-Day entirely, or proceed knowing the enemy might already know everything. For 3 agonizing days, Eisenhower issued a desperate order to every available unit: find the bodies. Search teams combed the waters off Lime Bay in small boats, using grappling hooks. Navy divers descended into the wreckage of LST-531, swimming through flooded compartments filled with corpses, searching for dog tags and identification. The tension at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was suffocating. Staff officers chain-smoked cigarettes and waited. Every hour without confirmation was another hour the Germans might be repositioning forces. Intelligence officers monitored all German radio traffic for any sign they had captured an American officer. Eisenhower paced, slept little, prepared contingency plans for cancellation. Finally, on the 3rd day, all 10 bodies were recovered. Every bigot officer was accounted for, every corpse identified. None had been captured. The secret was safe. D-Day would proceed. But the price of that relief was absolute silence. Within hours, survivors of the attack were assembled by military police and told in no uncertain terms, speak of this to anyone, fellow soldiers, family, civilians, and you will face immediate court-martial for compromising national security. The same threat was issued to doctors and nurses who had treated the wounded and pulled corpses from the water at field hospitals near Slapton Sands. Medical staff were ordered to falsify records. Death certificates listed vague causes like action in the European theater, killed in the line of duty, drowning with no location specified. Families received Western Union telegrams in the days that followed. Each one was identical. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son or husband was killed in action in the European theater. No details, no explanation, no mention of where or how or why, just the cold bureaucratic language of death. Mothers who had sent their sons off to war expecting them to die in France or Germany were told nothing about an English beach in Devon.
Mass graves were dug in secret in the hills above Slapton Sands. The bodies were buried without ceremony, without public acknowledgement, without headstones. British civilians who lived near the area and claimed to have seen lorries full of bodies or piles of corpses on the beach were visited by military police and told to forget what they had seen. When a local woman named Dorothy Seekings insisted she had witnessed the aftermath, she was threatened with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. The official line to anyone who asked, "Nothing happened. It was just a training exercise. Everything went according to plan." The casualty statistics from Exercise Tiger were not released by SHAEF until August 1944. 3 months later, buried deep in a routine report that combined training casualties with actual combat losses from the D-Day invasion. By then, the world's attention was on the liberation of France, the breakout from Normandy, the drive toward Paris. A training disaster in Devon was a footnote if it was mentioned at all. Most newspapers never reported it. Historians compiling the official records of D-Day omitted it entirely. The cover-up was complete. 749 men had died, and the world would never know. For decades, Exercise Tiger remained a ghost story, whispered among aging veterans who had survived it. Families who lost sons in the disaster were told nothing beyond the initial telegram. They had no graves to visit, no details to cling to. Some mothers spent years believing their sons might still be alive, prisoners of war who would return after the fighting ended. They waited in vain. Veterans who survived the attack carried the secret like a wound, bound by threats of court-martial even after the war ended in 1945. At reunions, they would drink and speak in coded language about that night or the thing we don't talk about, but never in public, never on the record. The fear remained. Some took the secret to their graves, never telling even their own children. The official narrative that 639 men died in the E-boat attack on April 28th, with an additional 110 casualties from a separate friendly fire incident on April 27th, when American soldiers on the beach were hit by naval shells fired short from their own ships during a live-fire beach assault, was accepted without question for 40 years. The numbers varied depending on which military report you read. The details were vague. No one pushed for answers because no one outside the military knew enough to ask the right questions. But secrets don't stay buried forever, especially when bodies wash ashore. In the 1970s and 1980s, local residents in Devon began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were there unmarked military graves in the hills? Why did elderly American veterans visiting Slapton Sands weep openly at the shoreline, kneeling in the sand as if in prayer? Why did official histories of D-Day contain almost no mention of the training exercises that prepared forces for the invasion? Slowly, through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by journalists and interviews with aging survivors who finally felt safe enough to speak, the truth began to emerge. British historian Nigel Lewis spent years piecing together the full scale of the disaster, not just the E-boat attack, but the friendly fire incident on April 27th that may have killed hundreds more when American soldiers on the beach were hit by naval shells fired short from their own ships. American researcher Ken Small became obsessed with Exercise Tiger after discovering a Sherman tank submerged off Slapton Sands in 1974. He spent years raising funds to recover it and turn it into a memorial. In 1984, exactly 40 years after the disaster, a memorial was finally erected at Slapton Sands. The salvaged Sherman tank, corroded and battle-scarred, now stands on a concrete plinth overlooking the beach where 749 men died. The inscription is simple, almost understated, but this Sherman tank was salvaged from the sea in 1984 and is dedicated to the memory of the officers and men of the United States forces who lost their lives during Exercise Tiger, the full-scale rehearsal for the D-Day invasion of Normandy, which took place in April 1944. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It is a quiet monument for a catastrophe that was anything but quiet. Every year on April 28th, aging veterans and their families gather at Slapton Sands for a commemoration service. Fewer come each year. Soon there will be none left who remember. The brutal arithmetic of war demands cold calculations. Generals must weigh lives against strategic objectives. Exercise Tiger was a disaster born of miscommunication, inadequate training, command failures, and sheer bad luck. The radio frequency incompatibility between American and British forces, the absence of HMS Scimitar, the improperly worn life vests, the German E-boat stumbling upon the convoy by accident. Any one of those factors addressed differently might have saved hundreds of lives. But it was also a sacrifice. 749 lives lost not just in a rehearsal, but to protect the greatest secret of the 20th century. The lessons learned from that night were written in blood and incorporated immediately into D-Day planning. Radio frequencies were standardized across all Allied naval forces. Life vest training became mandatory, with instructors demonstrating proper wear and conducting water survival drills. Small craft equipped for survivor rescue were added to every convoy. Escort protocols were tightened. On June 6, 1944, when Force U stormed Utah Beach under heavy fire, they did so with tactics refined and improved because of the men who drowned off Slapton Sands 6 weeks earlier. Utah Beach casualties were remarkably light, 197 killed, far fewer than the disaster that preceded it. The lessons of Exercise Tiger had been learned. The price had been paid in advance. The men of Exercise Tiger died in darkness, their names erased from history for decades, their families denied even the comfort of knowing where or how they fell. But their deaths were not meaningless. They ensured that D-Day succeeded. They saved lives on the beaches of Normandy. That is their legacy, a lie that saved the world, a cover-up that served a greater truth, a sacrifice made in secret so that others might live in freedom. The file is now open. The secret is told. Remember their names. Remember what they gave. And remember that some truths are buried not from shame, but for necessity, until the time comes when they can finally be honored.